In part 3, Professor Peterson will be talking about problems with interest group politics. What are the major problems with interest group politics?
Well, there's three of them. Unrepresentativeness, the organized win over the disorganized, and the present wins over the future.
Let's begin with the first problem. How is the interest group universe unrepresentative?
Well, a famous political scientist by the name of E.E. Schachtschneider once said, the flaw in the pluralist heaven, the pluralists, remember, thought that interest groups were the cat's meow, that we just had this wonderful world in America where all these groups are out there demanding this and that and the other. And Schachtschneider said, well, okay, but remember, the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. That is to say, interest groups tend to have people participating in them who come from better off occupations, are more educated, and have higher income. So this is a graph that shows the number of political actions that are taken by individuals. That is to say, they're more likely to be engaged in group politics. And you can see that the people in the upper class are more likely to participate than those who are not. So this is a good example of the heavenly chorus singing with an upper class accent.
How do interest groups favor organized over general interests?
Well, this is probably even more serious a problem. The narrow organized interest beats diffuse public opinion. We've seen how public opinion is inconsistent and incoherent, but does somehow exist out there. And the public may want something, such as they want controls on guns, but they don't know how to organize to get it because of the free rider problem. It's really hard for everybody out there who is against easy access to guns to get organized. Meanwhile, the National Rifle Association has used all of its selective incentives to build a viable organization in states throughout the country, and they can put tremendous pressure on legislators and members of Congress to prevent restrictions on access to various kinds of armed weapons. That's probably the best possible example, because public opinion is way on one side, National Rifle Association is on the other side, and the National Rifle Association usually wins. But it's not the only example. Farmers always want price supports. The consumers want cheaper food. And it's been very, very difficult to get government subsidies out of agriculture, despite the fact that the agriculture industry has gotten bigger and more powerful and richer, and really has very little basis for demanding extra monies from the government. The public would rather have the cheaper food, the lower taxes, but it's the agriculture sector that's well organized, the Farm Bureau, the Farmers Union, and the other special interest groups that are promoting subsidies to the agriculture sector. And then the industry, many industries want to restrict trade. Every economist knows that the more we trade with other countries, the more goods travel freely within the United States. The fewer trade restrictions, the more prosperous the economy is going to be, all other things being equal. Free trade is for the general good, but every industry wants restrictions, and oftentimes these industries win. And another good example is the public wants effective teachers. They'd like to dismiss the weak ones. I just saw a poll that says 20% of the population would protect weak teachers, 80% would fire them. But that doesn't happen because teacher unions are well organized and they want to protect the jobs of all their employees. So it's another example of the narrow organized interest beating diffuse public attitudes.
How do interest groups favor the present over the future?
And maybe this is the most serious issue of all, because groups are always demanding something now, even though the cost for doing so will burden the next generation. There's no better example of that than the demands for higher spending, for deficits, for huge government debts, for tax cuts, for not controlling a balanced budget. Because who's going to suffer from an unbalanced budget? It's going to be the next generation, people who aren't yet born. The next generation has no votes. Children do not have the right to vote. They don't have any interest group representing them. The spending groups are very powerful. So the present is being organized interests, bias policy in favor of those in power now, those who have the right to vote, those who are the adults now. And the same is true for environmental protection. If you're going to preserve the forests, the old ancient forests, you have to control the logging industry. But the logging industry is extremely organized, and it's only recently that the environmentalists have been able to mount some kind of opposition to their ability to cut down a treasure that the next generation is going to value even more than the current one. So there's plenty of examples, these are just a few, of the way in which the present is benefiting, exploiting the future through organized interests. So interest group politics sounds wonderful in the pluralist heaven, but it's got some major biases.
How is the Constitution supposed to limit the power of interest groups?
Well, it was going to do this by dividing power. And James Madison said, extend the political sphere, that is, to make it cover the entire country, and you take into account a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of citizens. And that's true. So because the United States is such a big country, there's always a place where some group can find a home that will not be invaded by the majority. So there are some benefits to having this very complex federal system with power divided and greatly extended to include a national government, but also to preserve local governments, that creates a set of governmental institutions that protects against the power of any particular interest group. Doesn't necessarily mean, however, that it's going to protect the future from the power of the present interest groups.
Is what Madison believed still true? You hinted that it wasn't, that it isn't. Or has interest group politics changed over the years?
Well, for one thing, we don't have the broad groups that we used to have in the past. We don't have, a lot of them grew out of the Civil War and the other wars, World War I, World War II, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Masons, the Odd Fellows, to say nothing of all the churches in the country. So all of these institutions tend to be inclusive institutions for people of all backgrounds. Today, if you join a group, it usually means writing a check and sending it off to the leaders of the group and letting them act on your behalf. So at one time, it was more like de Tocqueville talked about. Americans forming associations, creating a sense of community, working through institutions for the community as a whole. Now it's a lot more specific interest groups. And also groups are now organized on a national basis. Even your religious groups can be organized in a common political movement. And your pro-choice or your anti-choice groups are also organized on a national basis. So the growth of modern communication, the growth of a mass system of communication through the internet now means that we don't have that sense of local community that groups once created. And whether or not this nationalization of group politics is undermining the sense of community that sustains the well-being of the country as a whole is one of the issues that is yet to be determined. So the group politics of the past may not necessarily be the group politics of the future. The communications industry has transformed group politics just like it's transformed so many other things in American politics. Next time we'll talk about political parties because they are thought to be one of the best limitations on the power of interest groups.